if the agency is an executive agency, the Office of Management and Budget gets to look at the regulation, both before it comes out as a proposed regulation and before it comes out as final. The final rule is then published. Congress has a chance to review the regulation. I mean, Congress can nullify any regulation at any time, because Congress originally wrote the laws. Congress also has an expedited process for reviewing regulations called the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to very quickly veto a proposed regulation, or excuse me, veto a final regulation after it's come out. That's only been used once in history, actually. And then finally, regulations can also be appealed to the courts if you are affected by the regulation and you feel like the regulatory agency has exceeded its authority, or it's been arbitrary, or something about the process by which the regulation was adopted, you know, wasn't quite in accordance with the rules the agencies are supposed to play by. So, bottom line of this is there's an organized process for issuing regulations, and there are opportunities at various points for members of the public, you and me, to have some sort of an effect on what regulatory agencies do. As individual citizens or as members of other organizations, we can comment on proposed regulations to agencies. We can comment to the Office of Management and Budget when it is reviewing a regulation, if it's an executive agency regulation. We can make our views known to Congress, who ultimately writes the laws. And if you are very directly affected by a regulation, you may have standing to challenge that regulation in court. And even if you don't, if someone else challenges it in court, you may have the opportunity as a citizen to file what's called an amicus brief, or a friend of the court brief, offering some information or commentary on the regulation. So there are opportunities for public involvement in the process at every step of the way. Okay, a little bit more background. How much regulation is there on the federal level? There are a lot of ways of measuring regulation, and all of them are inaccurate. So don't take what I'm going to show you too seriously or literally. The main thing that measures of regulation can tell us is it big or little? And has it been increasing or decreasing? But other than that, these things are all pretty inexact. One way, traditionally, that scholars have tried to measure the amount of regulation is the number of pages in the Federal Register, because the Federal Register is where agencies have to publish proposed regulations and where they have to publish final regulations. This does not necessarily measure whether we are more or less regulated, because if an agency wants to deregulate something or reduce a regulatory burden, it also has to propose a new regulation that goes in the Federal Register. So deregulatory actions as well as regulatory actions have to go through the Federal Register. But this gives us a fairly good idea of the total amount of regulatory activity that agencies engage in, where you can see it went up during the Second World War, went down, went up during the Korean War, went down, gradually increased during Nixon, around 72, Nixon's second term. It ramped up tremendously, hit a peak in the final year when Jimmy Carter was president, fell somewhat under Ronald Reagan, and I'm losing my laser sight here now, but fell somewhat under Ronald Reagan, resumed growth under first President Bush, continued growing under Clinton, and then kind of leveled off a bit under the last President Bush. That's basically the trend if you look at Federal Register pages. There are other ways to look at regulatory trends. One is to look at regulatory agency expenditures in the federal budget. Now, these do not measure the total cost of regulation. They only measure what the federal government is spending to administer regulation. But you see that there's actually a fairly similar pattern where regulation has kind of waxed and waned. Sometimes it's increased rapidly, sometimes it's increased slowly. The biggest pronounced things in this pattern are, once again, by this measure, you have a bit of a dip during the Reagan years, and then you've got a huge spike during President Bush, or most recent President Bush, which largely reflects the increase in security regulations. Similarly, you can count the number of people in the federal government who are involved in regulation, and again, that follows a pattern somewhat similar to the pattern of expenditures. That big jump right after 2001 reflects the federalization of the air traffic screening force at airports, where previously the folks who did security at airports were private contractors who worked for the airlines, and then the federal government took over that screening. So we had an additional like 60,000 or so federal employees who came in as a result of that. These measures generally kind of track each other. It's not perfect, but You know, if you put spending versus Federal Register pages, you get kind of similar patterns. Some of the most interesting things here, you note though, are that during the Nixon and Carter years, it looks like the amount of regulatory activity increased faster than the amount of spending did. And that's also true if you would graph the number of personnel. So in terms of Federal Register pages, somehow regulators got more productive during the Nixon and Carter years in the sense that they were able to produce more pages per person. You also have this dip during Reagan and so forth. So regulation has gradually been growing. There have been some fluctuations in the trend. Oh, and there it is. There's the Federal Register pages versus regulatory staff. Again, you see this interesting phenomenon that it looks like for some reason in the 1970s, regulatory staff became much more productive and were able to produce a lot more Federal Register pages with fewer people. Another way of trying to measure the amount of regulation is looking at the total costs or the total benefits of regulation to get some idea of how much of an effect does it have. There are several measures of this. All of them are inaccurate, but the best ones out there, one of them comes from the Federal Office of Management and Budget. Within that Office of Management and Budget is an office called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is the office that reviews regulations. And according to law, every year they have to produce an annual estimate of the costs and benefits of federal regulations. The most recent estimate they came out with in 2009 basically said that the benefits are somewhere between $126 billion and $663 billion, pretty big range, and the costs are between $51 and $60 billion. Now this is not the total benefits and costs of all federal regulations. This is the total benefits and costs of federal regulations proposed within the past 10 years. So the total would arguably be a lot higher on either the cost side or the benefit side. The other kind of odd thing you need to know about this estimate is that the way they put this estimate together is to take the cost and the benefit figures that were calculated by federal agencies when they proposed these regulations, and then they add those up. So this is actually a measure of the costs and benefits that agencies anticipated when they proposed the regulations, not a measure of the actual costs or the actual benefits that actually occurred after the regulations were implemented. And the folks who do this report are well aware of what they're doing, and they will acknowledge the shortcomings of it. Another attempt to measure the cost of regulation was undertaken by the most recent version undertaken by one of my professors from graduate school, Mark Crane. Periodically, the Small Business Administration's Office of Advocacy, which advocates in the regulatory process on behalf of the interests of small businesses, periodically they commission an academic to do a report on the total cost of federal regulation and then break it down to see how it affects small businesses versus large businesses. The most recent version of that report estimates that the total cost of regulation is around $1 trillion or about $10,000 per household. Again, there are some problems with that study. It's been criticized on a number of grounds. But again, the picture we get from either the OMB calculations or from Mark Crane's study is similar, that the effect of regulation is pretty big. I mean, that's something I think we can conclude with like 99% certainty from this stuff, even given some of the problems with these studies. Well, there are different types of regulations that you should know about. One is economic regulation. That's government control of prices, government control of entry, government setting quality standards for products and services, that kind of things. Establishing other contract terms. But that's not the largest chunk of regulation. The largest chunk of regulation in terms of federal activity is actually health and safety regulations, whether it's workplace health and safety regulations or other kinds of health and safety regulations like all the homeland security regulations that are intended to somehow make us healthier or safer. I mentioned my FDA-approved toothbrush. That's a health and safety regulation as well. Health and safety